Hello and welcome to today's Developing a Multifaceted Approach to Ransomware webinar brought to you by Insight Cloud and Data Center Transformation. I'm Amanda Sharp, Marketing Specialist at Insight, and will be your moderator today. Before we begin, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. This webcast is designed to be interactive between you and the presenters. The webcast console you are looking at can be completely customized. You can resize or move any of the windows that you have open. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can click on the Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your question. All questions from this webcast will be captured. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please visit the webcast help guide by clicking on the question mark icon below the presentation window. The help guide covers common technical issues. Today, you will be hearing from Tunde Odole and Chris Kapusta. At Insight CDCT, Tunde leads a team of skilled cybersecurity professionals in providing strategic planning, consulting, security testing, and implementation services. He brings nearly a decade of experience in the field and expertise in all major security solutions offered today. Chris Kapusta is a principal architect with Insight CDCT, focusing on storage and data protection technologies. He provides mentorship and leadership to colleagues and serves as an SME for several topics and technologies. Chris's current focus is helping large enterprises with modernizing their IT operations on their journey towards digital transformation. I would now like to turn this presentation over to our presenters, Tunde and Chris. Chris, the floor is yours.
Excellent, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you're joining from. So I just wanted to take a couple minutes and go over kind of our agenda for today. We're going to start by talking about the evolution of ransomware. It's obviously more prominent today, especially with users working from home. We have a new topic called Ransom Cloud that we'd like to introduce, kind of covering what is it and how does it work. Cloud ransomware protection, how do we prevent ransomware in the cloud, but also as well as on-prem, and also how do we recover if an event does occur. The impact of backup solutions, we're definitely seeing an uptick of ransomware technologies targeting those storage and backup solutions first, especially when there's a ransom involved. It's usually easier to get a customer to pay or an impacted user to pay if there's no way of recovering that data. We're going to cover key capabilities for backup solutions in a ransomware attack scenario, what to look for, what architecture should I consider, how can I protect myself and my company, and most importantly, our data. We're going to cover SaaS solutions and why we should protect the data there, and really whose responsibility is it, especially with regards to ransomware. And recommendations, just from what we've helped clients and customers do to prevent and recover from such scenarios. So Tunde, I'll turn it over to you to kind of talk through the evolution of ransomware.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. Again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining. Let's make this as interactive as possible. So with that said, evolution of ransomware. Well, one of the things we try to do with this webinar is trying to stay away from just another ransomware presentation, right? So we've tried to focus on where is ransomware going at this point. We're all used to, and we've all seen the impact of ransomware in the on-premise environment, right? The storage, the backups that are being destroyed, the endpoints that are getting encrypted, Active Directory compromised, and all of that. But you really don't hear a lot about the impact of ransomware in the cloud, right? And obviously, if you look at the evolution of your typical workforce, obviously since COVID-19, we've seen a lot of evolution to the cloud, right? A lot of evolution to work from home. We've seen an explosion of remote access devices, remote access implementations. Obviously, BYOD has gone up a notch, and there's obviously an absolute consumption, increased consumption of whether it be IaaS, PaaS, or SaaS-based application. But the question is, when you ask the typical IT security or compliance person, how are you addressing your risks in the cloud? How are you protecting your data in the cloud? You typically don't get a lot of answers there. So what are we trying to say, really? One of the things we all need to be cognizant of is the fact that ransomware is now cloud aware, right? And one of the things that we always try to stress right off the bat is, and maybe this is one of the things that kind of drove the adoption of the cloud. There was this misconception that by me moving to the cloud, okay, the cloud services provider now takes over a lot of the responsibility of my data in the cloud. Yes, there are a lot of benefits. There are lots of benefits to moving to the cloud. But the grave misconception there is, that comes back to bite most folks, is the fact that who's responsible for the security of data in the cloud. If you look at most of the shared responsibility model documents and the ones that I have up here, actually this comes directly from AWS. It clearly states, right, the CSP's responsibility really stops at securing the cloud infrastructure in and of itself. The data that sits on top of that cloud, right, the governance, everything else around the data that you as a customer put in that cloud is totally your responsibility, whether IaaS, PaaS, or SaaS, or any other IaaS for that matter, right? So that's one thing we all have to be cognizant about. The other thing, again, just by virtue of feedback from customers, is the assumption that my data in the cloud is perfectly secure. I'm not responsible for recovery and all that stuff. Nothing could be further from the truth, right? Again, going back to that same shared responsibility model, you're responsible for the security of that data. The security of that data also includes the recovery of said data, right? As more and more companies are starting to consume a lot more collaboration solutions, cloud-based email, and everything of that nature. Couple that with, again, the explosion of a remote workforce, right? You now have the perfect storm for cloud-based ransomware. Obviously, with the adoption of cloud, traditional networking infrastructures are no longer inspecting our traffic. It's more of a work from home user hitting your cloud assets directly. And why should we, again, this is something that we felt that this was something that we needed to raise an awareness of, because as we talk to customers, yes, everyone's cognizant of the fact that we want to protect our on-prem assets. Ransomware is always discussed within the context of the on-prem assets, but it's never talked about the cloud. And if you look at the stat to the right, according to Veritas, again, 51% of cloud customers still believe that their backups are the cloud provider's responsibility. And again, nothing, and obviously Chris is going to attest to that here. I don't know, Chris, you got anything you want to add to that real quick?
Yeah, I was going to add to that. The cloud talks a lot in terms of high availability. You replicate between regions, make sure your data exists in more than one region, and you'll have so many nines of uptimes you won't know what to do with it. And what's really ignored there is replicating your data is not a great backup solution. It's great to have your data in more than one location, but if your primary copy is encrypted and that's replicated to multiple regions, all you have now is multiple regions of encrypted data. So they're the same premise we've been following for years with data protection on-prem, kind of that 3-2-1 model. It still applies in the cloud, and it's a point we try and drive home quite often, that it is not the cloud provider's responsibility to protect your data from that perspective. User errors, application errors, ransomware, anything that can go wrong is really on you as a consumer of that cloud.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And so along those same lines, let's talk about the concept of, again, this is a term that actually got coined. I believe the term ransom cloud kind of started, I would say, probably 2018, really. There's a really good hacker that kind of came up with that term, and obviously it's kind of taken off since then. But essentially, what is it, right? It's, as the name implies, it's really ransomware that's targeting the cloud for the most part, but not just any cloud, right? The use cases that we're seeing really at this point are cloud applications or cloud adoption that seems to be tied into some sort of email access, right? That's generally what we're seeing at this point. So right now, the proof of concepts that are out there's actually a documented video from Kevin Mitnick, a well-known ex-hacker, that documents this, how ransom cloud malware payload can easily get into an Office 365 account, for example, and pretty much in real time encrypt the entire contents of that inbox. It's well documented. It's only a matter of time before that proof of concept is expanded to now target SaaS applications, and we've already started seeing a rise in that. Right, this is a Netscope cloud report, for example, and as you can see here, we now see that cloud applications are now targets. I mean, that percentage is now up to 36%, and it makes perfect sense, because the moment we shifted from a work from home model, from the on-prem model to the work from home, it made perfect sense that the attackers, like any other business organization, would have to address their business practices to cater to their new clientele. In this case, they would go after cloud assets, and we're seeing a lot of that right now. So this begs the question, for assets that are in the cloud, is your risk assessment program, is your vulnerability management program, your annual testing, does it take into account your consumption in the cloud? Do you even know what assets you're consuming in the cloud? Because you'd be amazed how many customers, how many cloud adopters out there still don't have a good handle as to what their cloud consumption really looks like, between assets that they own and IoT assets. Essentially, you've got rogue individuals who can wake up a credit card and purchase any cloud application out there. So it does open up a whole different set of headaches as far as entities are concerned. How do you manage these threats as far as cloud adoption is concerned? Social engineering, it still works, despite all the security solutions that we have there. And this is a testament to the fact that in the security world, when we say there is no silver bullet, it literally does mean there is no silver bullet. I mean, we're all aware about the social engineering tactics. I mean, it's been out there for decades, yet it still works. And that's simply the fact that it's based on the fact that no matter how advanced our solutions get, the end user is always going to be the lowest hanging fruit. People can be conned, people can be deceived. So again, how we start to, and we'll get into some containment measures here in a second, but just something to think about as far as as far as how ransomware is now evolving into the cloud. So, poll question: essentially, where have you applied your most resources as far as ransomware in your environment? As we discussed earlier, right? Are we talking data workloads in the cloud? Are you approaching more of a data-centric approach where you're aligning those security controls more to the data, more to your workloads? Or are you targeting storage? Are you trying to deal with ransomware as far as storage and backups are concerned? Because we know those get targeted all the time. Networks, right? Networks are actually very important, right? We're all aware of the SonicWall breach, for example, right? That occurred about, I think, this prior month. It's only a matter of time that we're going to see a ramp up of these devices. So take a minute. Let's, if you all don't mind answering those real quick, and let's just see what the numbers look like. And we'll give it a couple of seconds here. All right, I think that's it. Okay, let's see what we got here. Okay, we've got another question. Restoring. I don't know, Chris, you want to take this real quick? Because I think this kind of falls more into data recovery and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think of restores in the traditional data protection perspective, we think of, how long does it take me to restore a file, to restore a system, to restore a virtual machine? And really, as we elevate this conversation to discuss ransomware, we're talking massive restores at scale. If I have an environment that's encrypted and I need to recover that data or pay a ransom, have we tested how long it'll take to restore entire environments from my backup solution? And we were seeing an increase of things like flash technologies and data protection environments, because the time to restore now becomes a very critical conversation in these ransomware discussions. if we have to pull data from the cloud to restore, if I've got tapes that I need to feed back in and restore, how long can my business survive with that entire environment down? So, we talk about restore at scale here, and the question really posing, do you test that today? Do you have a plan in place to restore at scale in the event of a ransomware attack?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Great. So let's see where we're. Okay, we've got some stats in. Okay, so very interesting. So we've got just over 14% looking at storage and backups, another 14% at networks, 14% at devices, and got over 57% in all of some of these areas. And that's really the idea, right? When it comes to the topic of ransomware, and there's no one right answer, frankly speaking, for this. It really depends on the exposure. One of the things that we always advocate is understanding your attack surface, right? And then mapping your response accordingly. So for some environments, their biggest exposure might be in the area of the storage and backups. In other environments, it might be the networks, it might be devices. But all in all, as long as those remediation action items and those initiatives are tied to some sort of a risk mapping exercise, that's usually the ideal way to go about these. And then for the other one, okay, so this is actually not surprising, right? So we're seeing, this actually comports with what we're seeing in the field. A lot of companies will back up, but then they don't test at all. And it kind of feeds into this whole incident response mentality as well. I would say a fair amount of companies will have an incident response plan, but no one actually tests that stuff, right? So Chris, my question to you really is, so as far as testing, recovery testing is concerned, especially when you're talking about a 14 terabyte environment, right? How does a company start to address such a thing, frankly?
Yeah, absolutely. It has to be part of their ransomware response plan to start with. Is we have to know how we restore entire environments. And I will point out this is different than a traditional DR test. I think a lot of the traditional business continuity strategies today are, I have a production site, I replicate data to a DR facility, and if something extreme happens on that production side, I fail over to DR and everything's fine. What's a little different in the ransomware discussion is these bad actors are spending 6 to 9 months. Once they've infiltrated a system, they're taking their time and going dormant and learning as much as they can about the environment. And really what they're targeting first is what we're seeing lately is storage environments and data protection environments. So a lot of our DR is I take a snapshot of something on my storage device in production, I replicate that to a DR facility, but what if those snapshots are deleted and I'm hours or days behind my replication before somebody notices, and at that point the encryption started and it's too late. And if my data protection environment's targeted, and I need to start restoring, what kind of backup, what kind of plan B or C in that case do I have to do that? So it's got to be different than our normal DR tests, and it's got to be tested at scale. And I know a popular kind of data protection technique today is to back up on site, but maybe use the cloud as long-term archive. What we really need to take into consideration is if I need to pull a good amount of that data down to start emergency restore, how long is that going to take, and how long can you survive while that's happening? So those are things that we kind of guide and look out for. Is, hey, the cloud is great for long-term archive, but I need to have another plan on-prem to pull that data should the worst occur.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Now, so going back to the question of the threat vectors that we touched on earlier, right? Obviously, we understand what cloud-based ransomware is. What are the common threat vectors that you would typically see, right? Now, and these are the big ones. We've seen an explosion in file sharing, obviously, whether it's the Teams or the Slack or whatever else is, whatever solution is your collaboration of choice. They all present clear and present danger, because if I were to pose a question out there, everybody's using these, but how many companies are actually inspecting the security of the contents or the file transfers in this collaboration solutions? Not a lot, frankly, because these are all self-contained solutions where, and most of the security solutions that we have, they kind of protect the typical barriers, like at the perimeter, firewall, at the ingress-egress point, or at the endpoint specifically. But as far as within the application in of itself, which is what collaboration is, besides email and web content filtering, most companies aren't inspecting what's actually going on within this collaboration application. And again, there's plenty of data around, again, people trying to be effective, sharing data, moving content back and forth between these collaboration applications. Yes, we might be inspecting email properly, but these collaborations applications, social media as well, right? There's a report that I was looking at where the number one, I think one of the more compromised SaaS applications out there are typically marketing applications. Because again, you can imagine everyone's trying to evolve their business. There's a lot. I mean, the marketing business is booming right now with innovation and all that kind of stuff. With all that innovation comes security gaps as new tools are being rolled out, trying to move quickly to market. Again, always remember, these are codes being developed, and with every code that's being written, there's always going to be some vulnerability at some point. So we're seeing a lot. So obviously those collaboration, file sharing, primary threat vector. I mean, we've got others like whether it be OneDrive, Box, Dropbox, or whatever, right? Anything gets encrypted on your laptop or desktop gets what? Like Chris mentioned, it just gets replicated into your cloud instance pretty much. And even though most individuals will think, well, I have versioning. Well, yeah, versioning is great and all that kind of stuff for the most part, but how many companies actually forget to remember to turn it on? For the most part. These are controls that they're there. There's certainly controls that you can put in place, implement to kind of reduce that exposure. But even something like versioning is not an absolute fix. It's not the absolute end all be all. It's one tool in that remediation or containment arsenal. Other things you need to be worried about, as I mentioned earlier, third-party applications, browser plugins. Again, one of the things that we forget is at the rate at which these applications are being pumped out, how certain are we that these applications have gone through some sort of a rigid SDLC process, right? To identify what codes are, what code flaws are within these applications. I mean, we hear all the time, data leakage within this application or data leakage within this cloud application over here. That's how all of these things start. And because a lot of these applications, these plugins are being written by third parties, we don't get a lot of visibility there. So these are all things that we really need to be concerned about. And then from a protection perspective, and I'll go over this real quick because I really want Chris to dive into the whole disaster recovery, business continuity piece of it, because that's a critical part of it. Always understand your exposure. That's the first thing you always have to do. What is your exposure? What's that?
Yeah. Sorry, not to interrupt you, Tunde, but an important point there I think we were talking about before this webinar was understanding your exposure just became more difficult with things like the SolarWinds incident. I mean, nobody would think that a software vendor I'm using, on-prem or in the cloud would have their software development process hacked and a malicious code put in that way. So, I mean, we think in traditional sense of, well, I have end users, I have firewalls, I have these perimeters I put up to protect, but I willingly let some of these applications in. And now how do I, now it's another vector that I have to take into account when understanding threats. Exactly.
And I'm glad you touched on that. This is where we get into the importance of third-party risk management. Your SDLC process, right? Again, yes, it's a headache. Yes, it makes this a whole lot more complicated, but you really do have to start somewhere. Frankly, most companies don't even have any kind of third-party risk management process. No supply chain risk management, nothing like that at all. I mean, again, you do have to start from somewhere. You do have to understand what your exposure looks like. Cloud consumption. Do you have an understanding of all the different assets that you are consuming in the cloud? Do you have visibility into that kind of stuff. If you don't have the right tool sets in place to A, have that visibility, and B, control what's going in and out of that environment, again, you're on the losing end of that battle. The other thing we typically recommend is, again, you want to have a sound cybersecurity framework, right? Security, gone are the days where you buy a firewall just because you know you should buy a firewall, right? I always tell folks, you could buy a mid-range firewall, but it could be properly secured. You could buy the most expensive firewall on the market and still be breached. It all depends on how sound your security framework is. Have you tightened down the areas that need to be tightened down? Again, from a perspective of cloud-based ransomware, the areas that we would typically focus on, right, user awareness, because we understand that cloud-based ransomware relies mostly on social engineering tactics. So user awareness becomes very critical. Web content security, right, to the extent possible. You might not be able to inspect your content within these collaboration applications, but ultimately always remember that whatever that malware payload is, it's got to phone home at some point, right? So that's one threat vector that, at least if you're monitoring, whether at a perimeter level, whether at a cloud border level, or even at an endpoint level, that would be an early warning indicator that, okay, something's going on. So even though you got an infected document, at least you were able to prevent any kind of CNC connection and those sorts of things. Another huge one is identity and access management. That's the other thing that we're seeing. A lot of companies are consuming cloud applications left, right, and center, but there is no federation whatsoever, right, of identities across the board. And the problem with that is you have users being forced into a situation where they're managing multiple different identities, and that's just a recipe for disaster. Any company that's really starting to move into a multi-SaaS environment, you really want to start to look at implementing some sort of identity and access management program to cohesively maintain single identities, single sign-on. It also makes for a better working environment, in my opinion, but it does give you a lot of visibility, gives you a lot of governance control as to what credentials who's doing what within your cloud instances, right? As Chris talked about earlier, you are going to have to rethink your business continuity, disaster recovery strategy. I mean, gone are the days where we're just backing up the servers to NAS devices on-prem and all that kind of stuff. Even, as he indicated, offloading data into the cloud. Yeah, there are pros and cons of it, and you really do need to weigh what those pros and cons are. And ultimately, an incident response plan. It's still amazing how many companies in this day and age do not have a sound incident response plan. If you don't have one, you really do need to start working on one, or get someone to assist in building one. So with that said, I think we've got, Chris, I'll let you take these ones.
Yeah. So our next poll question here, what do you see as the most pressing area to focus on related to ransomware in your environment? And again, we asked the question a little bit differently earlier with the same answers here of where are you spending your most time. But as you sit and kind of analyze, maybe gaps or areas of improvement today, just curious where you see the most pressing areas to focus on. So we'll give a quick second here for everyone to answer. All right, let's see what we have here. Not surprising. It almost seemed like a trick question, but yeah, I think, based on the title of this webinar alone, the multifaceted approach, I think this is not surprising to see that we really have to focus on all of these areas when we consider a ransomware strategy. Forget even a response, but just a strategy from a prevention as well as a response perspective. So not surprised to see that at all.
Yeah, absolutely.
So impact to backup solutions. And as we talked about earlier, and as we've been talking out, kind of throughout the webinar, we're seeing an increased attack surface on data protection and backup environments. And really, if you think about it, these bad actors are in there to demand a ransom. I'm holding your data hostage and I want money for it to get your data back. And storage devices and data protection devices, they have methodologies for protecting the data through different areas, be it snapshot or full data protection. So we are seeing an increased attack on these different technologies by these bad actors. If this bad actor can get in and destroy your method of recovery, it makes it a little bit easier to demand that ransom. And really, it's starting to talk about hardening our data protection environment, which is a very new conversation in a lot of ways. We back up everything. We make sure it's secure from is it available perspective, but we haven't really had the hardening conversation, up until very recently. And some backup architectures are more susceptible to ransomware than others, depending on underlying OS technologies they use. A number of solutions require hardware and software from many different vendors to put them together to make a cohesive solution. So how do they all play together? Are they all secure and hardened? It's a new conversation that we're seeing a lot of customers have. There's a lot of new players in the market that kind of took this ransomware approach as they developed their product, things like immutable file systems and even technologies to help detect ransomware. If you think about it, in most areas, the data protection environment is a copy that houses all of my data, be it it can be on-prem, it can be in the cloud, it can be SaaS, whatever. If I have that single collection, I have a really good platform to analyze whether or not I'm currently being impacted by ransomware. Do we see large change rates? Have dedupe and compression ratios fallen to the floor that are kind of early warning signs of encryption? So we're seeing a lot of newer technologies start to incorporate that detection phase into the backup portion because it's getting to scan all of that data coming in. And we're even seeing some of the more legacy vendors out there, I'll say more established vendors maybe rather than legacy, but we're seeing those vendors really start to build safeguards into their products to deal with the threat. So it's the industry as a whole, I think, is taking this very seriously and really enabling people to not only detect ransomware, but also defend against it and recover from it should an attack occur. So as we look at kind of design strategies, what do we need to start to think about or continue to think about if we're already having these conversations as we harden our backup infrastructure? Air gapping is something we've talked about in the industry for decades. Having a physically separate copy of my data that is not connected in any way, shape, or form to my network. And we see a lot of mixed messaging in the market on this today. There's a lot of claims of air gapping, but then you look and there's still network connections and access and things like that. So it's really taking a hard look at how we're doing it. Nobody likes the tape conversation, and tape's been dead for decades now, apparently, according to a lot of the messaging out there, but it's really not dead yet. It's probably one of the best ways to air gap our data is if I physically make a copy of it and lock it in Iron Mountain, and it's hard for somebody to try and encrypt that in that scenario. Now the trade-off becomes in the recovery. The trade-off becomes in the recovery section. So there's some trade-offs there that we need to help kind of architect and mitigate, but OS choices, we're seeing Linux generally being preferred to Windows just from an attack surface perspective. Tunde talked a lot about network and local authentication, implementing things like two-factor authentication, making sure there's single sign-on, anything we can do to harden that authentication process so we know that person logging into that environment is truly someone, A, that should be there, but B, is who they say they are. Worm snapshots, write once, read many times. So it's not a new technology, but it's one we see making a big comeback here to protect some of that data. And then it's where does the cloud fit? Cloud's starting to introduce things like object lock support. So I write data to the cloud. I can sort of make it immutable up there through lock support. We're seeing that across the different cloud providers out there. But it's also that conversation of Cloud's a really great replacement for tape for long-term archive. It's cheap. I can stick it in Glacier or Azure Archive and let it sit there forever and pay a lower cost for it. I won't say it's low cost, but lower cost for it. But then the restore conversation comes into play. If I need to pull a ton of that data out and restore it on-prem, what does that look like? And how long, again, and I know we've kind of beat this point home throughout the webinar, but how long can I survive and my business survive while I'm doing that? And I think Tunde mentioned this, nobody has it figured out yet. Nobody has the complete picture that there's just one-stop shop. I buy this, I'm completely protected from ransomware, and I'm guaranteed to recovery. So it's definitely an ongoing conversation, and it's a strategy that has to continually evolve as time goes on and as different ransomware strategies evolve. So kind of the key capabilities, we talked about some of this on the last slide, but I'll touch on it a little bit more here. Data immutability is extremely important. I need a way where I write data to a system or a file system. I need to make sure it cannot be deleted outside of that system. We're seeing, again, a lot of newcomers to this space have kind of built around immutability. A lot of the established vendors out there have introduced or brought immutability into their products as well. The cloud is starting to get different options for immutability. So we're seeing it kind of pick up and become more important here. There's storage vendors that are making immutable snapshots inside of their storage system to help prevent against ransomware attacks and snapshot deletion. So it's definitely a multifaceted approach from different areas of my environment to make sure that data is safe. And again, it's preventing that mass deletion of backup data. Detection is important. Again, in a lot of areas, the data protection environment's a centralized copy of all of my data. So if I have the ability to scan that and analyze that and glean extra information off of that, that's where I can start to make detection a little easier and help understand, are there areas in my environment that are being encrypted? And if it's truly immutable like it's supposed to be, I can recover from that because it's not impacting the data that's on the platform itself. And then we talked a lot about a remediation today, but when an attack occurs, how quickly can you recover? I mentioned earlier, we're seeing a large uptick in flash in data protection environments because it's no longer a conversation of how cheap and deep can I go. It's a question of, really how fast can I restore? So if quick RTO times are really something your business requires, it may be worth looking at introducing some of those flash technologies into our data protection environment. And then I know we've talked a lot about cloud today and even SaaS today, but I like this chart because it really helps break down the responsibilities in the SaaS environment. There's a lot of Office 365, Google Workplace customers out there, Slack, Salesforce, you name it, all the SaaS providers out there. Really, as we mentioned earlier, what are they responsible for? They're responsible for the physical infrastructure that this is sitting on. They secure their data centers, they secure and maintain the health of the physical servers and storage and network, and they mitigate against disasters of their equipment. Anything you put on there is your job to protect. And things like user errors, security breaches, application logic errors, all of those different things that can go wrong, that's your responsibility to recover. And there's a news article out there about a law firm that was on, I think it was on the Google Office suite, and had their data deleted and went to Google for a backup, and they basically said, sorry, that's not our job. And that message is not quite clear when you're swiping that credit card and clicking I accept in those terms and conditions. And so it's a point we like to drive home that you are responsible for your data, regardless if it's on-prem or in the cloud or in a SaaS provider. So I think we have one.
Looks like we have a question.
I think we did have a question come in.
Yes. The question is, why is SSO considered a benefit when a compromised SSO account now has access to all of those other apps?
So I'll take that one. So that's actually a great question. So this is one of those situations where there are pros and cons. It's like encryption. It's a double-edged sword. SSO is similar in that to the point that the question is referring. Yes, it is a gap in that you compromise one account and then you literally got access to multiple applications. However, that used to be the case. However, that lends the importance of making sure that if you are going to be doing single sign-on, you want to make sure that you're doing single sign-on very well. Meaning you are obviously doing the typical MFA, but then and all that kind of stuff. But then there are other controls that are built into it. So things like, I don't know, conditional access, for example. Is this user typically logging on from Florida? All of a sudden they're showing up from Japan, for example. So there are controls that have been built into most identity and access management solutions to mitigate that gap. But single sign-on, from a security operations perspective, is something that's an absolute must, especially as you start to as customers start to consume more and more cloud. It just makes for, from a governance perspective, same thing with Active Directory, right? Within your typical on-prem environment, it makes no sense for you to have different identities for different applications. It just makes for a management nightmare, right? So again, for that ease of user experience, for that ease of governance, auditability, accountability, all those things that we always want to see in security, single sign-on is key. But at the same time, you want to make sure if it's done right, yes, single sign-on can be a very, very valuable tool to the business.
And I think they find, through various studies, is the more accounts you expect people to maintain, they either use weaker passwords or the same passwords anyways. Yeah. So I think there's definitely a trade-off there of having a plethora of identity management. And then, a lot of it is building it into your corporate HR policies as well. When an employee's terminated for whatever reason, it's easier to shut down these accounts through SSO versus, Absolutely. Oh, well, we forgot product X because that's a separate management solution and that former employee still has access. And so it's a trade-off like everything else. And it's, I would, to Tunde's point, I think it's a piece of the puzzle, but it's not the entire solution.
Yeah.
Okay, and I think we have, so we have a poll question up right now. I've got a second one here to how confident are you in your organization's incident response plan for responding to a ransomware attack? So are you very confident all the way down to not sure or even we don't have a plan to respond to ransomware? So again, these are anonymous. We're not going to report you. So. Okay, give it one more second here. All right, so 50-50 on the first one. Are you monitoring for threats in your SaaS and cloud applications? And that's about what I would expect to say. I would say 50-50 is about right. And on Tunde, if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things where it's kind of a new venture, frankly, for most companies. We're all used to monitoring for threats within the traditional on-prem infrastructure, right? But the cloud just presents a whole different animal. It's one thing for me to throw in a couple of sensors into an IaaS or a PaaS environment, for example, where it's just an extension of my on-prem infrastructure. That might be easier. But now when we're talking about SaaS applications, right, where all we're getting is just API feeds, for example, that's where the level of complexity kind of comes in for. So it stands to reason that it'd probably be about a 50-50. But that is certainly something that companies need to start paying attention to in this day and age.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So in our second poll here, again, I don't think any surprises on the answers here. It's for those that say we don't have a plan, it's obviously something that needs to be put into place, especially, I know everyone hates this term at this point, but the new normal with remote workforces and kind of data distributed all over the place, there needs to be a cohesive plan in place to recover should something be compromised along the way.
Yeah. And in security, just to add to that, it's, as we always say, it's not if, but when it happens. So it will happen at some point. We all hate it, but in this new normal is just something we have to be prepared for. So.
Absolutely. All right, so just a couple slides left today, but recommendations. So from a data protection perspective, just keep in mind not all workloads require the same SLAs. These again are conversations I think we've been having for a while here around data protection, but you need to define specific requirements for data protection and recoverability. So again, how do I recover from ransomware? How do we recover at scale? I think we've beat that point pretty well here throughout this webinar. But learning about the capabilities of existing arrays to help mitigate and reduce complexity where appropriate. So snapshots, replications. I know a lot of array vendors, as I mentioned, are putting in methodologies for protecting snapshots where some are going even to the extreme that I have to call the vendor and get a two-factor authentication to delete certain snapshots. So I mean, they are taking this seriously. It does help as another layer of protection. So I'm not relying totally on, say, a data protection environment as my single way of restoring and protecting the environment. So, and then, begin testing emerging technology. There's a lot of new players in the market that have had kind of starting from scratch, have had a good methodology for focusing on ransomware detection and prevention, as well as data immutability. It's really, doing data assessments to understand what's out there. So how do I need to break down, what data types I have, what the ownership is, all the kind of traditional security aspects of data to understand what's out there, what I need to protect, what is business critical, email, et cetera. Business impact analysis, risk analysis to understand data requirements. So it's really all about understanding the data, what data needs to be protected, what is business critical, and then using some of the methodologies we discussed today to protect that data and make sure that we do have a cohesive ransomware strategy.
Yeah, to kind of add to that, Chris, and you touch on an important topic there, right? Business impact analysis, which means you would have to start taking a look at the criticalities of your system, right? Getting into data classification, for example. All data is not equal to the business. Some data sets are more important than others. So I think one of the mistakes that most companies make is they try to assume that all assets are equal, all data is equal. Well, you could start off with that, absolutely. But that once your consumption starts to grow, I mean, if you're a 14 terabyte environment, for example, then you need to start making some hard decisions. This starts to open up conversations around what is your corporate retention policy, for example, right? Did you actually need to retain all that data for 10 years and all that kind of stuff? Maybe this is where you start moving some stuff to write once, read multiple time, cold storage. So it starts to open up those sorts of strategies as well. But I think you touched on a great point there with the business impact analysis. So.
Absolutely. Appreciate it. And then just to kind of close out today, some resources we have available for helping develop those ransomware plans, understanding those business impacts. You can see some of the ebooks and reports and infographics we have out there, as well as information on, you can follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter. We do a lot of LinkedIn live sessions. I know around ransomware, there's a few other topics. So if you need help in that journey, we're here, and we're excited to work with you.
Chris, we did have a couple other questions come in if we have time.
Absolutely.
Okay, the first one is, how do you determine the best recovery point if ransomware has been in the environment for a while?
That's an interesting one.
That is an interesting one.
I would say this is where forensics kind of comes in for starters, right? Because obviously, again, you get exposed to a ransomware incident. Forensics at that point needs to determine approximately when that event occurred, and then hopefully you've got backups prior to that event start date. Because unless you do that, it makes the recovery process very dicey, especially when the average dwell time for attackers in the environment is 200 days plus. So it's a hard one, but also this is where any kind of incident response forensics analysis can help determine A, what is the best recovery point, and B, validating that recovery point and those recovery sets are clean and pristine state. That'd be my opinion.
No, absolutely, and I think you touched on an important point there that I'm not sure we made during the rest of this webinar, but a lot when we talk retention periods of data, a lot of that is driven by legal departments today. Is how long do I legally need to maintain it, and then how quickly can I get rid of it? Are what we see a lot of the conversations revolve around, and I think it's important to mention that ransomware kind of changes the retention policies as well, because as we've mentioned, they sit 200 days plus in the environment and start to wreak havoc. And I need to make sure I can recover. Not that I need to go 200 days back, but I've heard customers with a 2-week retention period. Well, if they've started deleting things over those 2 weeks, you may be out of luck there. So retention periods definitely come into play, but I think that's where where we see a lot of the ransomware detection that's being brought into these data protection technologies. I think that can help in that forensics piece as well, as to understand when did things start to kind of go south, and we need to look at restoring beyond that. So as Tunde mentioned, I think it's heavily around the forensics and response to that event.
Great, thank you. We have another one that just came in. Any suggestions for an attack loop scenario where the attacker lays in wait, infecting malware, but not activating it, and where it gets into the backup?
Well, so that's where threat detection really comes in, right? Because if you that's how these attacks can really be nefarious, right? As we discussed earlier on, there's several things that go into this whole ransomware protection, right? It's not the backups are an important piece, right? But there's also the visibility, the proactive aspect of things. How well are you monitoring your networks, right? To your point, yes, the attackers will lurk and duel for a while. Maybe you couldn't detect them when they got into the environment, but hopefully you're monitoring your egress traffic to where the moment you start seeing some strange connections going to CNC sites or something like that, that should be a red flag. Hopefully you have some sort of a network threat defense solutions that all of a sudden, if an encryption or if somebody's talking to a domain controller at 3 a.m. in the morning and all of a sudden query multiple accounts, you're getting notified. So there's a lot of detection technology that would need to be looked at, that would address such a gap. Visibility is going to be key for that, because unless you know the attacker is there, I mean, you're losing that battle right there. And so there's all sorts of things, right? There's some typical what we call TTPs, techniques and processes, procedures that attackers would typically use. If you're monitoring for all these things and there's solutions that can do that, it raises the odds that you'll pick up on something, that you'll find, okay, someone's running something that's out of the norm, and hopefully that triggers an event and you go investigating at that point. That'd be my take.
Yeah, and I'll say we're seeing a lot of data protection vendors start to incorporate malware and virus detection into their products as well. So the way I read the question is, I've backed up the malware and I restore to that point where the malware is still there. You know, how do I avoid that loop scenario? So I think we're seeing vendors start to help mitigate that scenario through incorporating those technologies. And to Tunde's point earlier, forensics doesn't stop when I do that restore. So it's not as simple as, I'm encrypted, I restored from 2 days ago and I'm back, I forget anything happened and I move on with life. There's post-event forensics as well to make sure that those systems you have restored are not attack points and surfaces going forward. So it becomes an ongoing struggle. I know we all have a million things going on in the world today, and this just adds on to our list of things that we have to stay vigilant on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. I think we have one more that might wrap up the whole thing. How do you know you have been hit with ransomware in the cloud?
So visibility, detection technology. That's really it, right? So it's, again, there's proactive and then there's reactive. On the proactive side, do you have a continuous vulnerability management program, which incorporates your cloud assets? Are you continuously scanning your cloud assets for any kind of vulnerabilities, gaps, holes, and those sorts of things? That's on the proactive side. But on the reactive side, that's really where detection technologies kind of come in. Right. Are you monitoring traffic? coming in and out of your cloud instance, for example, right? Are you monitoring activity, what's going on within those cloud instances? Again, this is where an enterprise identity and access management solution becomes very, very important, because obviously for the attacker to get into your instance, they have to leverage some sort of authentication, right? Visibility around who's doing what's occurring within those cloud instances. Those can be early warning signs that something is going on within your cloud instance. So this is where, again, if you're going to be moving into the cloud, be prepared to invest in technologies to fully secure the cloud, because as we've touched on, there's a lot of stuff that the cloud gives you, but generally from a security perspective, you, the customer, are still responsible for making sure that whatever security framework you've implemented for your traditional on-prem stuff, you adopt that and you evolve that to your cloud protection as well. So that's really the only way to deal with those sorts of things. All right. Any other questions?
It doesn't look like it.
All right, cool. Awesome. So Chris, you want to close us out?
Yeah, absolutely. We want to thank everyone for the time today. On the agenda slide, it was noted that there is a Sonos One giveaway today. Our events team will be running that raffle, and we'll notify the winner after the webinar today. So good luck, everyone. I've got a few at home, and they're awesome speakers. So I just appreciate everyone's time, and hopefully this was beneficial.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone.